If you're looking for a great pair of long-lasting, water-resistant Bluetooth headphones to wear during your workouts, stick around to the end of the show because I've got a 65% off product code just for you. Kirk Cousins has an image problem. No matter how hard he tries and no matter how well he plays, he very rarely wins big games against good teams. It's a narrative that started back in Washington and only got worse in Minnesota after he got paid, and I'll be honest, even I started to wonder if Cousins was worth all of that money by the end of last season considering the results. I mean, a 5-25 career record against winning teams and a 1-6 record in 2018 alone is pretty damn awful after all. But, me being me, I didn't want to write Kirk off without any evidence first, so this week I decided to go through his 6 losses against winning teams from last season to find out exactly why he lost all of them. It was, not gonna lie, pretty painful to watch, but I can say that by the end of that 2-day torture session, I did come out on the other side with a very new perspective. The Vikings didn't lose all of those games last year because of Kirk Cousins, but rather Kirk Cousins lost all of those games last year because of the Vikings. Let's go through those 6 losses one by one, in order, because each loss was kind of its own special flavor of frustration. And to understand the overall problem with Minnesota, you have to first understand all of the little problems that form the foundations of their mediocrity. We'll start with that Week 4 shootout loss to the Rams, which ironically might have been Cousins' best statistical game of the year. Obviously, you can point to the defense and say that giving up 38 points to LA is the main reason for the loss, especially because the Rams were able to get Anthony Barr matched up on an island 3 times for touchdowns before the Vikings made any adjustments. But Cousins did play well enough to keep the game within 10 points with about 8.5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. He then drove the offense down the field in 7 plays to get inside the Rams' 15-yard line, where this crucial third down play happened. Right tackle Rashad Hill got smoked off the edge by Ndamukong Suh of all people, and by the time Cousins hit the top of his drop, Suh was already coming clean for a huge hit that he couldn't get away from. This killed the drive, and Minnesota was forced to take a field goal, which still did at least cut the Rams' lead to 1 possession. After the field goal, the Vikings defense then did a good job forcing a 3-and-out, one of only 2 3-and-outs they forced the entire day, and Cousins got the ball back with 2:20 on the clock and 2 timeouts. Honestly, considering how poorly the offensive line had played, and how poorly the defense had played up to this point, even being in position for a 2-minute drill to tie the game was probably best case scenario anyway. So naturally, the offensive line had to try to ruin that best case scenario again by immediately giving up a sack on first down, because that's just what they do. Fear not though, because even when given 2nd and 18 and then a subsequent 3rd and 9 because of that sack, Cousins was still able to put the offense on his back and dig them out of that hole with back-to-back strikes to Laquan Treadwell. Those 2 plays put the ship back on course, and Cousins was now at midfield with a 1.5 minutes left and still those 2 timeouts in his back pocket. Things were looking good here on a fresh set of downs, almost like the Vikings would be able to pull this comeback off after all, until Riley Reiff got beat again. Cousins got stripped, the Rams recovered, and that was the ballgame. All of that buildup, all of that effort by Cousins to bail his offensive line out, and they let him down again for 3 sacks on the final 2 drives when he needed them the most. I mean, just look at Riley Reiff here. Look at this terrible, awful technique. He's standing so far upright with very little knee bend, his weight is too far forward, he's giving the edge rusher free access to his chest. I mean, there's nothing balanced or strong about this position, and all John Franklin Myers had to do was just get low, give Reiff a little one-arm stab, and dip through a shortened corner around the edge to get to Cousins' throwing arm. There was nothing that Cousins could do about this, and it's not like he could really step up away from Franklin Myers either, because Mike Remmers got bull rushed straight through the middle of the pocket anyway. I mean, watching this game just frustrated the hell out of me because Kirk was finally in position to maybe kill a few narratives, but now all he's remembered for in this game instead is just fumbling on the last drive and losing 38-31. This loss was not his fault. He threw for over 400 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks, and led the Vikings in rushing, and still lost. That's just baffling to me that someone can play that well against a really good team and still lose because of things beyond their control. But maybe the most frustrating thing is that as bad as that game was, in Minnesota's next loss against a good team, in Week 8 against the Saints, the rest of the offense let Cousins down even more than they did against LA. I'm serious, as far as shooting yourself in the foot goes, that Saints game was one of the most impressive displays of self-sabotage that I've seen in a really long time. Take this sequence from late in the second quarter as an example, because this was probably the biggest turning point in the whole game. Minnesota was up 13-10 here when Harrison Smith picked off Drew Brees with 3 minutes left in the half. Given that free extra possession, Cousins marched right down the field to get inside the red zone with about a minute left, and at that point the Vikings were in position to take a 10-point lead into halftime if they scored, while also getting the ball back to start the third quarter as well, so things were looking very good. And then, almost right on cue, on the most routine of screenplays, Adam Thielen fumbled the ball on the 14-yard line, New Orleans recovered, and returned it all the way back to the Vikings' 18-yard line, completely flipping the field and killing any momentum the Vikings had built up. 2 plays later, Alvin Kamara dove into the end zone from 1 yard out, and suddenly Cousins went from potentially having a 10-point lead to being down by 4 going into the locker room. Then, to make things even worse, when Minnesota went for it on 4th and 1 from their own 45-yard line to start the third quarter in some kind of ballsy attempt to try to seize back control of the game, Laquan Treadwell let a good ball from Cousins bounce right off his outstretched hands, and they turned it over on downs. The Vikings defense did manage to stiffen up inside the red zone and hold New Orleans to a field goal, but I mean, hell, they started the drive inside of Vikings territory, so a field goal was basically the best that Minnesota could hope for anyway. But then, don't worry, it still got worse. On the very next Vikings possession, Cousins threw a pick 6 because of a miscommunication with Stephon Diggs, where he expected Diggs to keep running on his shallow cross, like he's supposed to do against man coverage by the way, but Diggs sat the route down over the middle instead, which allowed PJ Williams to intercept this ball totally uncontested. I mean, this whole sequence over the course of just 10 minutes of game clock across 2 quarters was about as disastrous as I've ever seen for any single team. Minnesota went from being in the lead and knocking on the door of expanding that lead to 2 possessions to being down by 14 points, and none of those mistakes that led to that 14-point hole were Cousins' fault. Did he make some mistakes in this game and miss a couple throws? Sure, a few, but none of his mistakes were bad enough that I think he could really be blamed for this loss. On nearly consecutive drives, Cousins had 3 separate receivers let him down with major errors, and those 3 errors completely changed the fabric of the game. Minnesota is not built to dig themselves out of huge holes. They can't pass protect for shit, and once the Vikings had to solely rely on passing just to stay in the game, I mean, it was over. The Saints' defensive line teed off on Cousins and pressured him over and over again, even sacking him one time on only a 3-man rush just because they could, and honestly this game just made me feel bad for Kirk. He played really well overall, but sometimes there's just nothing that one man can do to overcome the mistakes of many, and this was one of those instances. It was just plain ugly. A few weeks later, that ugliness didn't get any better when the Vikings took on their next above 500 opponent, the Bears, and as you know, they got smacked around again. Truth be told, ironically, this loss actually probably was on Kirk though, and it was the only quote-unquote big game loss of the year that I do think was mostly his fault. He was pressing way too hard to try to make a play after an early Dalvin Cook fumble, and he threw 2 completely dumbass interceptions as a result, one of which was a no-look pass on a corner flat concept against cover 2 that Eddie Jackson grabbed for a pick 6. I mean, this game was just stupid from the moment the coin flip hit the ground. Chicago kicked their ass up front all night long, nobody could get open, and Kirk tried to play hero ball at every possible opportunity to disastrous results. The whole team was bad, but Cousins was worse, so if you did want to chalk this one up as a victory for Team Kirk can't win big games, I would totally understand. He kinda deserves that one. Minnesota's next big game loss 2 weeks later, however, was once again not Cousins' fault. That was their embarrassing loss to the Patriots where, in my opinion, the Vikings' whole coaching staff just got straight up out-schemed from start to finish. John DeFilippo somehow only ran the ball 13 times all game and threw 44 times, despite the fact that Minnesota's yards per carry as a team was about 3 yards higher than their yards per pass attempt, which, spoiler alert, that's really f***ing bad. And then when those constant passes inevitably failed and Minnesota fell behind the chains on third downs, Belichick came into that matchup with a perfect game plan to disrupt the Vikings receiving core early in their routes with bump and run coverage, and he trusted that Cousins' offensive line could not hold up long enough to let him punish that bump and run deep down the field. And you know what? He was right. Cousins was under siege on every third and long, and there were a lot of third and longs. Their average third down distance to convert was nearly 8 yards, which is crazy high. And when you combine bump and run coverage, receivers not being able to win in the first 2 seconds of their routes, and an offensive line that couldn't protect for more than those 2 seconds, what you end up with is Cousins having absolutely nowhere to throw and nowhere to run. There was really nothing that Cousins could do about this game because DeFilippo set him up for failure from the beginning, and he made 0 adjustments to fix his mistakes in play calling. Yes, Cousins did throw 2 interceptions, but they were absolutely not the reason they lost. The first pick was with about 5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter off a deflection when he was just trying to make a play to get them back in the game, and then the second pick was in the last 30 seconds, again where he was just trying to make a play and push the ball downfield. They were down 14 at that time. It was meaningless in the grand scheme of things, and I don't really hold it against him. Was it dumb? Yeah, but it didn't realistically affect the game at all. When you look at the box score for that loss to New England and read the headlines, you see that Cousins threw 2 fourth quarter interceptions and had less than 5 yards per attempt. But when you actually watch that game and how utterly terribly it was coached and coordinated relative to the job that the Patriots staff was doing, it's pretty damn clear that the film from that game tells a much different story than the stats. I do not blame Kirk one bit for that loss, other than maybe the fact that I just wish he went rogue and started calling his own plays to save himself from his coaches. And speaking of coach flip, by the way, the very next week when the Vikings lost yet another game against a winning team, the Seahawks, that was the loss that got him fired. Minnesota had 7 short yardage opportunities on third downs in that very close game, and for reference, short yardage opportunities are defined as 3 yards or less. And do you know how many runs DeFilippo called on those 7 short yardage downs? 3, and 2 of them were QB sneaks. They did not move the chains on any of their 4 short yardage passes, which killed all 4 of those possessions. That's 3 punts and a turnover on downs, all because once again the Vikings patently refused to run the ball and help out their quarterback. Only the Vikings could somehow manage to be in the top 6 in the NFL in total third and short opportunities with 63, and still only run the ball 17 times all year in those situations. That's the 4th fewest in the NFL, despite having the 6th most chances. Cousins critics may say, well, yeah, but later in the fourth quarter he was late on a corner route to Thielen that got broken up, which forced a field goal attempt instead of moving the chains, and that field goal was blocked, and that led to Minnesota falling behind by 3 scores in the final 5 minutes, but you know what? I don't care. There was so much other bullshit in the first 3.5 quarters leading up to that moment that I cannot in good conscience say, well, if he just made 1 throw, everything would be fine. No, it wouldn't be fine. Nothing about that game plan or the play calling was fine, and you cannot expect Cousins to be flawless on every single play just to even the odds against his own coaching staff. That's just not fair to him or any other quarterback to expect that. Oh, and by the way, that blocked field goal by Wagner was illegal and should not have counted anyway, but that's besides the point, and it's already been argued to death. On Cousins' next drive after that illegally blocked field goal, he once again got flushed by pressure immediately because Dalvin Cook somehow missed a chip block for his right tackle, and then Kirk got strip sacked from behind to end the game with yet another defensive touchdown. Once again, Cousins critics are going to say he missed that throw and he fumbled that ball, it was all his fault no matter what, but actually watching the game from start to finish and putting that in the context of the whole season's failures tells a different story. I'm not going to blame Kirk for his offensive coordinator throwing away 4 perfectly good drives. I'm not going to blame him for his running back missing a block or a referee missing an obvious penalty. I can't blame him for all that just because of 1 late throw and 1 incompletion, and neither should anybody else. That's not fair to him, and he's been through enough unfair criticism already. Do you know what the worst loss of the year was, though, and the one that he got the most undue heat for? The most gut-wrenching, embarrassing, terribly shameful big game loss for the entire organization? The last one, Week 17 against the Bears. That loss had everything from all the losses before it, all in one singular shitty game. There was bad third down pass protection leading to Cousins getting blown up multiple times. There was Cousins making questionable decisions out of pure desperation. There was another offensive coordinator getting away from the run game for absolutely no reason. And yes, I'm looking at you, Kevin Stefanski. And in a slightly new wrinkle, there was also Stefanski inexplicably trying to isolate Stephon Diggs on shallow crosses over and over again, despite the Bears making it very clear that they were going to be using jump calls in the secondary to shut that down. And if you aren't quite sure what I mean by that, I'll use a couple different failed third downs as examples to give you some context for the kind of play calling that Cousins was dealing with last year. This is from about 5 minutes left in the first quarter on 3rd and 5, and the Vikings have a variation of a mesh play dialed up from bunch left to try to spring Diggs free on that shallow cross underneath. Ideally, if everything goes well, Aldrick Robinson will set the pick on Roquan Smith, and potentially also a pick on Kyle Fuller if he's trailing Diggs in coverage. The nickel corner will carry Adam Thielen up the seam, and that should open up a whole lot of green grass for Diggs to run after the catch and pick up a first down. Now, when it comes to the Bears' defensive coverage here, referred to as cover 4, how a lot of cover 4 defenses around the league function against bunch receiver sets like this one is that the 3 closest quarter zone defenders to that bunch, meaning the cornerback on that bunch side and both safeties, will all be keying on one of those 3 receivers in the bunch, while the backside quarter zone defender, which in this case is Kyle Fuller, will pretty much only worry about just the one receiver on his side. If any of those 3 wide receivers in the bunch release outside to the boundary, the cornerback is responsible for just that outside receiver and that receiver only. If a second receiver runs up the seam inside of that first receiver and runs anything more than about 10 yards down the field, the strong safety will pick them up and shadow the route anywhere from that point, no matter what direction it breaks. And of course, if a third receiver runs anything deeper than 10 yards over the middle, or even just to the backside seam, no matter what the route is, again, the free safety is responsible for picking that up. So this is a really good coverage against trips, or trio, or tray, or bunch, or any other 3x1 formation you can think of, because no matter what, every receiver will be accounted for down the field no matter where they line up before the snap. However, a potential weakness to this coverage is that it leaves whichever one of your cornerbacks are isolated on Stephon Diggs in a really tricky spot, because that corner might not actually get any help if Diggs just immediately shoots inside on a slant or a shallow cross or anything like that. Both of those kinds of routes are excellent at creating quick separation, especially if the corner is lined up with outside leverage, and Kyle Fuller is lined up with outside leverage here. Fuller can't rely on Danny Trevathan for help because Danny has to account for Dalvin Cook in the flat, and he can't rely on Roquan Smith either because Smith has to help out with an inside bracket against those receivers in the bunch. So Fuller is kind of screwed here if the Vikings call a mesh play, which they did. Having said all of that though, that's where Vic Fangio's coaching comes into play to put his guys in a better position to succeed, or rather just not to fail. Fangio likes to have his safeties help out his corners in cover 4 by using what are referred to as jump calls. A jump call is basically a zone replacement between 2 defensive backs, which I've talked about on this channel before if you remember the Marshawn Lattimore episode a couple years ago. And on a jump call, the safety, Adrian Amos, is not keying in on the bunch like in most cover 4s, but rather he's keying in on Diggs. If Diggs immediately releases inside on a shallow cross, and obviously he does, Amos's job is now to jump that route from a better position of leverage than Fuller has, while Fuller then rotates back to Amos's position to pick up any number 3 receiver that might be coming into his zone down the field. This rotation all by itself completely kills this play because Amos is in a much better position than Fuller ever would be to either break it up or to make a strong tackle short of the sticks, and he's also coming from so deep and from such a sharp angle that it's really hard for any quarterback to see that rotation coming in the first place. Diggs got tackled 3 yards short of a first down, and it's easy to write this off as just great scheming from Fangio and great execution from the Bears defense, but my biggest problem with this concept is that the Vikings kept trying to make it work even after it became very clear that Fangio was not going to let it work. Stefanski tried to beat the same cover 4 look that was using the same jump calls with virtually the same concept 3 times on 3rd or 4th downs, and Chicago shut it down all 3 times. And even worse, the 3rd time he tried it was on the most important play of the game on 4th and 3 with only 7 minutes left in the 4th quarter. It was still only an 11-point game at that time, and they had a shot to move the chains and get back into it. The The Vikings just had to dial up literally any other concept than the one that had failed on 2 key third downs already, but Stefanski just couldn't let it go. He had to keep trying it, and he had to keep running into that brick wall until it cost them the game. That Week 17 disaster was a microcosm of the entire season, because everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, and it went wrong against a division rival that didn't even have anything to play for. Embarrassing isn't a strong enough word for it, to be honest, but it's not solely Kirk Cousins' embarrassment to deal with. When you look back at the entire year with full context, could anyone blame Cousins for losing all 6 of those big games? No. Maybe one of them, but all of them? Definitely not. His line was terrible, his receivers made mistakes, there were communication errors all over the place, his coordinators refused to even bother with the run game at times, even in situations where running the ball was a good idea, and even when they tried to pass the ball instead, they sometimes kept going back to the same concepts over and over the defenses saw coming from a mile away. As a whole, this offense was immensely disappointing, but that doesn't mean that Kirk himself was disappointing. Truth be told, considering the protection issues, the run game issues, the communication issues, and the play calling issues, I think he had a damn good season. Putting up 4,300 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions through all of that nonsense is damn near a miracle, in my opinion, and the good news for Vikings fans, at least, is that most of that nonsense, or at least a significant chunk of it, should be rectified in 2019. The front office made big strides towards fixing the offensive line in the offseason, most notably drafting Garrett Bradbury in the first round, who to me is basically a clone of Jason Kelce, and you all know how I feel about him. And they also brought in Josh Klein to play guard, who isn't really a great run blocker, but he is a good pass protector, so that's still an upgrade. When it comes to the communication problems, he's now in year 2 with his receivers, so you expect that to get ironed out a bit now that they've had some more time to throw together. And for the problems with the system itself, they brought in Gary Kubiak, who's one of the better offensive minds and offensive teachers of the last 3 decades. To me, when you look at Cousins and the narrative that surrounds him because of some notable failures earlier in his career, his reputation as a big game loser is nothing more than a series of very unfortunate events. Every worst case scenario you can think of actually happened, and all that did was just fan the flames for everyone to call Cousins out for stuff that wasn't his fault. Is he an elite quarterback? Obviously not, but he's arguably the only reason why Minnesota was still even in the playoff hunt in Week 17 last year. He fought through a lot of adversity to stay in contention, and at least on paper, most of that adversity has been dealt with now heading into this season. I can't promise or predict just how far this team is going to go this coming year, but I do at least think that they're going to be better, which is a start. The Vikings have 7 more games in 2019 against teams that made the playoffs last season, which are 7 more opportunities for Kirk Cousins to redeem himself. Just remember that as you're watching those games this year, if things do go wrong again, don't be so quick to blame the easy target just because it's easy. Sometimes the real problems are the ones that you don't immediately see. And sometimes the one man who takes the heat for every single one of those problems no matter what is really the only chance you've got to win. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode, and I want to thank Cove Audio for returning to sponsor this show as well. They really loved the response and the reviews that you guys had for their products the last time they were a sponsor, and so now they're back with yet another 65% off discount code for all Film Room viewers. This time it's for the Strive Bluetooth Sport headphones, and I've got 2 pairs personally, one for me, and then I got another one for my wife because she wouldn't stop stealing mine. But we both love them. We've had them for probably about 2 or 3 months now. They last us usually 3 complete workouts before I have to recharge them, which comes out to, I guess, about 6.5 hours total. They reduce ambient background noise, so you get a fuller, clearer sound, especially if maybe you're on a treadmill, which makes noise and you want to hear more music and less treadmill, so that's great. And they're water resistant, so if you work out in the rain or run in the rain or whatever you want to do in the rain. I live in Southern California, so I haven't tested that because rain is just kind of an urban legend here, but I trust them on that one that they're water resistant. But if you are yourself looking for a new pair of Bluetooth headphones that is more tailored towards an active lifestyle and kind of built for that, I highly recommend you take a look at these Kove headphones, and if you decide you want to buy them at the link down below as well, use promo code Kollmann, my last name, and you'll get a huge 65% off discount. So it is super worth it to use that promo code. As for me and channel news, I'll be back next week with my annual fantasy football positional rankings and draft values, which a lot of you have been asking for lately, and of course those will be available in chart and list format and updated weekly throughout the preseason over on my Patreon for all patrons exclusively. So if you're a patron, keep an eye out for those as well. The week after that, I'll be releasing another Film Room episode on a topic that I haven't quite figured out yet, but I do have a few really good options, so I'm sure you guys are gonna like that one too. So we've got a lot of stuff coming up on the channel, and then before you know it, we're right back in the regular season. We're right back into that, 60, 70, sometimes 80-hour-a-week grind when I'm putting out multiple shows every single week from August until February, but I'm super pumped for it. It's my favorite time of year, and I really can't wait. So I'll see you guys all next week with those fantasy rankings to kind of kick things off, and yeah, until then, later.